welcome 6-8 social studies teachers to our virtual PL, always at a safe social distance during a pandemic. Today, this screencast should allow you to get ready to do some planning for fall. So a significant amount of your time today is given over to you working either individually or in PLC teams to craft learning for what would be voluntary distance learning, were we to return in the fall to virtual learning. But the product you create also might be a great tool to use in-person learning, since we'll have some new tools at our disposal with all students having laptops in the fall. And so that's some sort of overview today that you can use to kind of get your bearings for your own work time. I'll be reachable during office hours, which we'll talk about later. But our session objectives today are really to kind of give you just a quick update on social studies curriculum and instruction, which I did via email, but in case you missed it, we've now done all hiring for summer positions, and so that's all set. We'll be able to get through that pretty quickly. And then we're going to try and key in on the professional learning modules from June 3rd. And I'll be doing that through use of the instructional cycle, because it's my understanding teachers were not expected to do all three modules, and that if they did one, they could certainly dive into that as their focus of planning. But I wanted you to see how it all fits together, and the instructional cycle is really the thing that binds our understanding of how effective teaching and learning works with those essential tools and concepts presented in June 3rd professional learning. And then we're going to talk about some lessening unit planning basics that really need to be there as we go forward, whether we're in an in-person or a distance learning environment. By the end of this session, my hope is, and by the way, that might include office hours if you reach out to me, or if you're good to go, you don't even have to talk to me, you can just get to work planning. But we really want to make sure our social studies curriculum happens in that instructional cycle. When I started teaching, I tended to look at a really good unit plan as having a lot of engagement activities for students and, passed on some content, developed some skills, and that's it. But rarely, for example, did I really kind of get into the requirements of what I was really getting after. Sharing the objectives for the unit with students, really focusing on, by the end of this unit, I really want you to be able to do this thing. Giving them access to the language of, we didn't really have standards then, but to the language of the objective and what good work looks like. And so in recent years, I really saw the effect of the instructional cycle in my own work in the classroom, that students, when they were given access to that language, could really thrive. Then it really kind of is up to you to follow your way through the second bullet point. Some of you may have done all three modules, but others may have just done the providing and communicating clear learning goals, or maybe just the assessment for learning module that was created. That's fine, but the instructional cycle slides I'll show you, paired to the one or more modules you did, should kind of help you put it all into the right context, and then you get to go and plan the sweet gift of time, which is, I think, a really positive thing that we've been given with PL. We aren't in the habit of getting a lot of time for planning, and we've got that today. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all this stuff, but it is available in an email sent recently announcing summer curriculum positions. Again, we've hired for all those, but we are going to do some work on 6th grade social studies, which was a completed course, looks great, but when 7th grade changed to contemporary world issues, it had a kind of a domino effect back to 6th. And 6th will finish its redesign, and it will exist in a Google environment entirely. It'll still be found on Canvas, but it'll exist in a Google environment, and it'll also be in a Google Drive. Geography is one of the things that we want to kind of beef up in our approach. We want to make sure that we do it consistent with how the sort of geography that sticks is best done. And so when I was in middle school, I had to do the rote memorization test of the states and capitals, but we found at high school that even if we've had students experience that, even in elementary levels, they don't typically retain it, and they don't know what to do with it when they have it. And so our map moments will be integrated to content, so students will have systems for how they analyze maps, but then they'll be able to dive into tables and documents and other stimuli that really kind of advance their geographic knowledge. And so we'll carry that map moment idea into 7th grade, making sure we always situate the places we're studying in geographic context, and they may do some work on common formative assessment design. And then finally, 8th grade might be in need of refreshment, but what its greatest need is right now is to get out of the Microsoft 365 environment and head on over to Google. So there might be some tweaks to the units of study, but by and large, it should exist just about the same. This is a course that will transfer to the Google environment this summer, but then next summer it may get some additional attention. But I want to make sure that teachers feel empowered to deal with like the 2020 federal elections as a topic, because remember, 8th grade is really a civics and early American history course, not just early American history. Okay, so session objective check-in. Looks like we nailed the first one. So let's get into the meat of my presentation, which is really about the Office of Teaching and Learning, PL, and how it relates to social studies. So this graphic's probably not news to anybody. This has probably been in principals, PDs, PD sessions, and I've certainly used it before. But this is kind of like the difference between, I think, teaching now and teaching, when I was in class as a student. We start with goals and objectives and standards that are pretty darn crystal clear. And we now share those with students, and we model that instruction at first. We're constantly looking for feedback from students and asking them things like, well, how many of you think you understand what I'm getting at here? And we might even have them, collaboratively get at something after I've modeled it, and maybe get a snapshot of some indication of how comfortable they feel even in that moment. And eventually they're going to get that, again, as part of that gradual release of responsibility model, some time on their own to show what they know. But that's not where the teaching stops. We look at the data from the assessments, and we start to prescribe different things for different students. And sometimes it's teaching the whole class a thing. It's teaching a few people in class a thing. But we try to really kind of close the book on that. Social studies classes, really the standards cycle through the course so frequently. They are meant to take a year to go. We don't really freak out if our students don't understand much about a standard in September. We get concerned about maybe November, December a little bit, and we start to really shape instruction, but we already know that they're going to get lots of opportunities for their standards. But this is a good map for us to use. So I've relinked the stuff from June 3rd PL, the Google Classroom sites for the 3 modules that you had. And you can certainly go into those and ask me questions during office hours. You might have just clicked on those and realized you're watching a screencast. I put the slide deck into the materials that will be available to you. So if you could get to this screencast because you were directed to click on it, by your principal or whatever, the slide deck was right there too. So just know that you can get access to all this stuff. So those PL modules really kind of enter this instructional cycle document more so than where they're depicted here. But the providing and communicating clear learning targets is something that does happen very early in the teaching process. The direct instruction part happens early, initially through modeling, but direct instruction can also come through the debrief of the first thing that a collaborative group of students produces. And then assessment for learning is all over this stuff. Assessment for learning can happen with the targeted instruction stuff. It can happen in the informed teaching part. The data analysis will tell us what the next assessment needs to look like, and so on and so forth. And so I think that the team that put together those modules really chose wisely about the things that really need to be driving instruction. And when we think about, again, the distance learning context, well, these are things that can happen in person or via Google Classroom and remote learning. Or Canvas. You can do Canvas too. I know some people love it. Okay, so we're already to our third session objective, which is really about your time to plan, but keeping in mind that you'll be doing it in an in-person or a distance learning environment. And so there's a couple things we should keep in mind about where we're going at grades 6 through 8. So the work led by Adam Zimmerman really around closing our achievement gap when it comes to literacy, and that's both math and language arts, using iReady, for example, is still going. And in fact, we're getting to really hone our ideas on what makes for an effective assessment, for example. And so as you're going forward with your planning, most of you start probably with the priority standards and learning targets anyway. Keep doing that. But we've got some different pathways to go down for working with common formative assessments. We have our common assessment template tools that are really kind of meant to scaffold learning in the classroom, where individuals or groups of students may actually use those tools, or a teacher might model instruction using a tool. We've got our common formative assessment examples from last year. We didn't get to debrief those much. If the first Friday coming back from spring break, we were supposed to look at student samples and design a new assessment. We'll probably emphasize the common on those. Last year, we were kind of like some grades, we're like, well, we're at different points in the scope and sequence. Well, that's going to change next year. We'll give the same assessment. The kids should have enough contact with the standards that shouldn't matter. If the content is confusing them, then we need to get, in kind of line with our scope and sequence and just make sure that that's guaranteed across the district. We also have a nice format in our distance learning packets that the teams put together for the COVID-19 closures. I can see those being kind of a common formative or common assessment measure we might use. Then, your next step after thinking about the standards and targets and how we're supposed to assess it, we should find a fall unit of study and then plan a cycle of instruction. Maybe that doesn't go through the whole unit because some of our units are pretty long, but one that would go through what at K-5 level they might call a line of learning. We're going to call it a cycle of instruction. Okay, so the questions you might want to think about as you do that final step in your planning is, okay, so what do I have to think about in my planning for an in-person lesson or distance learning? If we're looking at more closings next year, it seems to me to be a good plan to kind of consider the distance learning aspect. Your kids might be on site, but we might want to prepare them for distance learning later. What's it look like? How's it work? What do they have to do? What do you have to do? What do we have to do? Those types of things. And so I think the design for in-person or distance learning, I'd probably lean that more towards distance learning, even if you're standing in front of your students. We want to talk about the ways to get the words and meaning of the standard in front of students early in the instructional cycle. So if that means going in and having a discussion board where students kind of work through the meaning of it, and then teacher gives feedback to students working at home on what they should be looking for and what they should be doing as the instructional activities continue, great, we want to do that. Okay, so next up then is how do I build a gradual release of responsibility across the cycle of instruction, going from we do to y'all do. Slovenian immigrant friends who would say use, as in like you doing okay? That's the y'all, maybe they're working together. But we want them eventually getting to that ability to do things independently and alone. And then finally, how do I find those assessments for learning, informal or formal, to really help students kind of, get guided along the pathway to the standard and target that is the focus of that instructional cycle. Okay, so that's all here. And so you'll have access to these slides. You can certainly lean on them in planning. This might be one that we might touch on during office hours. If you're like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this or thinking about doing that, but it doesn't look exactly like what's in the current unit of study. We're going to say, go for it. We've got to make changes. We've got to be flexible. We just got to stay on more or less the same schedule if you're concerned about content being a barrier to a common assessment. If you're not concerned about that, if you're like, nah, we're going to be working in the skills, I don't need to worry about that part, that's fine. Go ahead and play around a little bit. Invite kids to engage in assessment for learning processes through direct instruction, after direct instruction, all that stuff, always in the language of the standard, and so on and so forth. So as we look at what's going to happen over the next year, assuming that things are returning to some level of normality, and I'm not saying they will, but if we did, we would be looking at giving common formative assessments with a common stimulus or stimuli every 4 to 6 weeks. They would be centered around grade level text or on grade level text or complex stimuli like a challenging table chart or graph, for example. There will be a constructed response format that requires writing. And then we'll also be collecting exemplars of student work to serve as exemplars for them to use in the future. So our assessments in 1 year might inform student work the next year. Maybe the students don't even take that, they just look at assessment examples. But we're going to be really kind of focusing on that. So the more you can build that in to your processes next year at a distance or in person, the better. And then again, data is going to drive that instruction a lot. This is a great slide to spend some time in. The print is small, so I'm not even going to mess with it, but we're taking a lot of our guidance on assessments from ANET or AchievementNet. They really focus on assessment and equity. That's going to be stuff we can learn about in future Fridays. And then finally, I'm sorry this is a screencast. I'd love to be with you in person, but feel free to join my office hours. You can click the link on the last slide. I'll be there all morning. Maybe email first in case I'm in the bathroom or something, but I will get in touch with you. Have a great summer.